Enrico Fardella, it's December 6, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much, Ali. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tomorrow is the China-EU summit in Beijing, and what better than having you on the program to talk about China-EU relations. And while the global south is, talking about diplomatic autonomy, a lot of people around the world are thinking that maybe European Union has gone into a diplomatic vasectomy and has lost its mojo in more ways than one. Will EU have the clout to make those important, tough decisions without pressure from Washington across the Atlantic tomorrow in Beijing?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me go straight to the point. My answer is no. I don't think that Europe has that capacity. Certainly not strategic autonomy that has been, it's like is a label has been used in the past. I mean, it's more an horizon, an ideal horizon that of course is very far from being reached. The problem are the classic problem. I mean, first of all, we shouldn't forget that when we talk about the European Union vis-a-vis the PRC, we're talking about two completely different entities. The PRC is like a classic nation state, very much centralized, where the European Union is more a dream and then else. And so is internal division is somehow they are part of the nature of the European Union as an actor. So it's like probably there is an excess of democracy, if we can say, and this of course decreases the capacity to express governance. And then when it comes to the PRC, this kind of controversy becomes quite evident. The PRC capacity to implement decision vis-a-vis the European Union is a internal division that then translate into uncertainties. To be frank, actually, one of the gift that the PRC has given to Europe very recently is that as in the case of the United States, paradoxically, Europe has become less risk averse towards the PRC, and therefore the PRC is an incentive for the European Union countries to act more in a more collective way. So, if among all the dossiers of the European Union, probably the PRC these days is becoming more and more, say, a unifying element. But of course, there are still strong division. If you look at the preliminary meetings that were meant to prepare the agenda for the 24th summit, European Union PRC summit, is to be, as you correctly said, is going to take place in Beijing in the next days. I mean, they were not very productive, and what we can get is that there is a lot of frustration from the European side, because it seems that the PRC keep repeating like old points, and they don't really address the European Union request, especially when it comes to subsidies to industries. We know that there is a ongoing investigation on electric vehicles, and which is of course doesn't please the PRC. There was a ping pong of an exchange between the Commission and PRC authorities on this point, very critical exchange. So, to make a long story short, I think that the prospects are not very good.
Enrico, it's wonderful to have you with us. I've got a lorry load of questions parked in my yachts behind me. So I would like to ask you three, but Ali will interrupt. So I'm going to do two. The first one is about China. China would like to see Europe strengthen its strategic autonomy. It craves this multipolar order, and it looks to Europe to be able to juxtapose, to create this, if you like, this triangle of the Sino world, the US world, and European world, where China sits between them. And yet, what it does seems to be driving a wedge in Europe. From Beijing's perspective, how can it overcome this contradiction? My second question is, if you look at the big four in Europe, there is Italy, France, Germany, and Spain, right? For China, there is a clear Mediterranean strategy. Do you think that adds to tensions amongst the big EU4? in terms of their relations and their concerns about China, or do they have their own very different agendas, Enrico?
Okay, thank you very much, Anush. It's great seeing you, and very good questions. The first question is, it's actually difficult to address in a short answer. I would say that when the logic of Chinese foreign policy is, if we have to find the matrix of the Chinese foreign policy action or logic, is the anti-hegemonic logic. So for China, the concept is that as long as US hegemony, as perceived by the PRC, prevails, this is like a direct threat to Chinese security, Chinese autonomy, and deprive the PRC from the legitimate space that China is looking for in the international order. So therefore, here the European Union being like an important, not just an economic actor, but most importantly a security partner of the US within NATO. So the capacity of China has using the economic leverage to attract the European Union into a more independent stance vis-a-vis the United States is, of course, fundamental. And if the PRC Beijing managed to do this, is a success. The reality is that the problem is that I think that the PRC has never had like full trust of the European Union as an actor per se. So in general, the European policies are bilateral policies. I would say the only thing that matters for the EU, I think, is the role of the EU as a reserve currency, to balance the role of the dollar. But when it comes to individual countries, I mean, this is where actually the PRC managed to create, a strong wedge. And we saw this, for example, several times, between, for example, like in the case of Hungary, in the case of Greece, countries that are more prone, to disconnect from the main consensus within the European institutions that is becoming more and more critical towards Beijing, while Greece, in the case of human rights, and also for the shipping interests that connect the country with the PRC, and the Hungary, or also for a strong economic interest from China, they actually disagree or took position that are against this kind of consensus. So this is basically the PRC is using economic clout, economic leverage among like internal constituencies in these countries that, of course, have, especially in the economic field, they have powerful incentive, to maintain or even better develop the relationship with Beijing. Used this economic leverage on these constituencies, domestic constituencies, to put pressure into at a political level in order to diminish the space for anti-China forces within the EU, and therefore create a sort of incentive for internal competition to have stronger relationship with China. And the second question is the Mediterranean.
So what are the tensions within EU in terms of cultivating ties with China? Obviously, we're going to talk about Italy shortly in any case, given the significance of what's going on there in terms of their relations with China in a minute. But for China, the Mediterranean is really important. At the same time, Germany is really important. So what drives the concerns of a country like Spain or France or Germany, for that matter, because we'll come to Italy shortly, in terms of trying to plug European Union agenda around their national interests? What are their concerns?
Okay, so the first element is, in general, there is an internal competition because after the Ukraine war, the pressure on the European industries and European economy has been very strong. So Germany first and foremost, and so the necessity to decouple to reinvent our energy security, create very powerful incentive towards the transition, the green transition of our industry. And of course, China was key to this transition. For at an industrial level, when we talk about this transition, of course, companies that can't implement this transition without Chinese technology, battery first and foremost. So China is a sort of so there is this kind. The contradiction comes from the fact that until a few years ago, this form of interdependence was part of our national interest, and so all the countries within Europe and also the European Commission, they were trying to boost this interdependence. Now, interdependence is actually is not more an asset, is a liability, and so there is also this kind of friction within the European institution, but also within every single country and among the European countries, in somehow to manage this kind of this difficult compromise between like reduction of interdependence, so more autonomy from the Chinese market, but at the same time, without jeopardizing, the interest of these constituencies and and our industry. And I think that to a certain extent, the European Union has done a pretty good job to synthesize this, of course, with all the limitation of the institution that we mentioned before. Especially given the fact that, in general, we tend to overemphasize our dependence on the Chinese market, and we forget that actually China is even more dependent on the European market for its exports. So there is space for action. That's why the anti-coercion instrument that was recently approved by the Council, it proves that this is the direction that the European Union is taking.
Enrico, staying at the macro issues, there is growing prediction. I wouldn't say with certainty, but there is growing prediction and possibility that Donald Trump may come back to the office. Now, in the past, I would say 6 years, and particularly the past 4 years, EU has gone up the escalation ladder vis-a-vis supporting, assisting, and in tandem with the United States. Now, Donald Trump has announced if he comes to the office, he's going to abolish the Inflation Reduction Act and pedal back on many of the environmental issues and all of that. Will EU, from a strategic point of view, from your perspective, find itself high on escalation ladder? And if it wants to come down, Donald Trump has moved those steps as well. Is that something that EU may find itself on energy, on Nord Stream, on China? Is there a risk there?
Yes, there is a risk. In my opinion, I think this is a very interesting point. And I just had like a mind-blowing discussion with some colleagues on the potential impact of Donald Trump on I would say U.S.-China relations. I think that the main point there is maybe it's a bit counterintuitive, if I may, okay, because the mechanism is very important. The reality is that, in my opinion, the key question today is not exactly what's the different position of the European Union vis-a-vis the US on China. I think that what is going to happen is how we manage a situation in which the main traction of globalization, which was based on the American capacity to absorb the excess production, the excess of Chinese production. So the end of US capacity to absorb these excesses, how is going to be handled? This is like the key question in a moment, especially in a moment when China's economy is facing like all the distortion of Chinese economy that have been there for almost 20 years now. The saturation of Chinese economy, the saturation of this economic model are actually coming up to surface. And so here it's very interesting what Trump can do vis-a-vis, for example, a democratic president. So is Trump going to unplug, for example, by implementing, for example, actions that could be a nuclear weapon for both the European Union and China, such as like taxing like non-productive investment in the United States. This could be a blow to the Chinese economic model, but also to the European Union economy. This is, in my opinion, this is the key point. Of course, we had memories of Trump and Angela Merkel meeting that were like actually very visual. And so in Europe, I would say that the election of Trump would generate an incentive for a stronger incentive for so-called strategic autonomy. But to be honest, I think that the key question is how to handle this problem, is how to handle the end of an economic model that for more than 4 years we called globalization, but was based on US willingness and capacity to absorb this excess production that actually Germany and Italy as well are also exporting to that country. But this is over, and so how we get out of this situation. This is a very interesting point, and the Chinese are very well aware. This is actually the reason why they invented the Belt Road Initiative.
Right.
That's the reason why they came up with the Belt Road Initiative after the Lehman Brothers crisis. And the blow that the American consumer capacity was gave to Chinese exports, and so they perceived that they had to find alternative demand for their products.
Enrico, if there were proper Marxist-Leninists, they would see what you're saying in the context of the crisis of capitalism that goes back to Lenin. And of course, overcapacity, overproduction is the symbolic element of capitalism in crisis. Now, you're absolutely right in terms of market saturation, and we just cannot continue to produce at levels and then expect them to be sold in quantities to generate the profit margins to keep this wheel going round and round and round. And there is hope that maybe after China, India can succeed it. Ali and I don't think so. We don't think India has got anything like the capacity or the infrastructure or the drive that China demonstrated in the last 40 years. So be that as it is, right? For European countries also, I mean, I'll take your point that Europe is a major export market for China, no question. But at the same time, if you look at Germany, for example, its motor car industry, if you look at Italy's luxury goods products, apparel and leather goods, as well as other luxury goods, China is now probably their key primary market. That the US is there, but they don't seem to be getting the same kind of yields that they get from China. So if this crisis of capitalism is going to reduce the Chinese ability to purchase European goods, and if the American market is saturating, does it make sense for Europe and China to create this Eurasian market to take the US out of the equation?
I think, honestly, I mean, I may be wrong, but I think this is completely, in mathematical terms, it's actually impossible. I mean, there is the only way for this to happen, as I said before, would be if, I think that the decision is going to be taken in Washington. So in my opinion, the direction where we are going now is actually the opposite. The direction where we are going is what, that somehow is expressed by these fancy words like friendly shoring or near shoring, which is somehow define a trajectory that is opposite toward of the one that was centered on China, globalization and offshoring to China, right? The direction that we are taking is actually a separation where security, economic transactions are more and more filtered and screened through security lens and political framework, and so this creates like more, I would say, tuning of like-minded countries. The problem is that the way how PRC operates and the way how the PRC conceive into the international system is not comparable. I'm not judging whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's simply becoming more and more incompatible with the way how liberal democracies work or pretend to work. Which is actually the difference is important. And so what is emerging, in my opinion, is a new architecture, a sort of like a sort of NATO style, for economy and technology that puts like-minded countries like Europe, Japan, the US, of course, together more than the movement towards a Eurasian integration. I think this is like something that is, if we consider the European component of Eurasia, but then of course the Middle East is a different story. But the European component of this design is not going to be part of this. Is not part of this process, in my opinion. And actually, actually the best case scenario, going back to what we said before, thinking about the Trump option. So again, the decision is going to be taken by the US. That's why the American election are very important. Either, there is like a sort of protectionist, like Monroe style, Monroe Doctrine style decision to unplug for the US hegemony of the dollar. And so the US may become like the economy number one at the expenses of all these supply side competitors, European Union and China first and foremost. Or the alternative, which is, in my opinion, is more peaceful, but at the same time is more practical, is a new Bretton Woods 2.0. You talk about the crisis of capitalism. I mean, but this, John Maynard Keynes, when in the time of Bretton Woods, he was talking about this. He was talking about, the problem of a system that basically competes, just compressing, household capacity and, and exporting all this distortion and production by stealing, the demand of other countries. And so this kind of if you look at this new architecture that is coming up, this is, in my opinion, a potential option, probably more, tuned with the Democrats' values and horizon than the Trump, or maybe Republican as well, but not Trump for sure. So this is, in my opinion, an option more than the Eurasian integration that we had in mind. We discussed, especially when the Belt and Road Initiative was living like its best times.
Enrico, since 2005, China has invested roughly $25 billion in foreign direct investment in Italy. That is roughly 1.3 billion a year. Chinese tourism, luxury sector, as Anush rightly said. What else could China done in order economically to accommodate or to please or to support Italy's needs and demands? What is missing? As an Italian, as somebody, as a subject matter, I mean, what else do you think is that delta and deficit through the eyes of Rome that was expected? What is Italy supporting and exporting today as an industry that fell short in the eyes of Rome? And why are they moving out? Is this only in solidarity? Because you said the relationships are very bilateral with the rest of the European Union as a body, or China could have done more?
Let's start from the end. Of course, China could have done more, but they can't do more. So the answer is simple, in the sense that if I take your question, we imply that Italy is, so we basically read word by word, and so we believe word by word in what has been said, in the sense that the reason why Italy is leaving the Belt and Road Initiative is because, there was not much exchange, economic returns. In my opinion, I think this is not the case. I mean, this is of course an excuse, but this is not the case. It's a political decision. First of all, I mean, nobody really believed that when the Belt and Road Initiative, the memorandum was signed, there was the idea that a piece of paper, a memorandum of understanding for a liberal democracy like Italy, the idea that you sign a piece of paper, which is basically a gift to Xi Jinping for his visit to Italy, to give face to Xi Jinping. This is a procedure that was in the China contest, political contest, not in the Italian political contest. So this was already an aberration of the Italian, or better, it was a gift given to Xi Jinping. It was a political action, that was meant to somehow symbolize the position of the two main parties at the time that were anti-European and anti-American. But it was, I never thought that, this agreement, the idea that, I mean, it's a political failure and an economic miscalculation to think that a piece of paper can change the economic structure of two countries. The reason why China doesn't, or Italy, doesn't export more to China is not because China is unkind or because China is cold. It's just an economic structure of the two countries. The Chinese investment, vice versa, going back to your point, the nature of Chinese investment has been mostly based, were not very much, most of it, they were not greenfield. And so if I may say that probably the big topic about Chinese investment in Italy is that they were not, creating value for Italy as a country. They were more, I would say, speculative investment, we can call them. Also, there is a huge debate about it, but I don't think that China could have done more in economic terms because I think that there is the structure of the two countries impedes this from happening, and everybody knew this. The reality is that probably politically China could have done more by providing public goods to Italy in order, if you want to have, in order to reinforce and give credibility and resilience to this very strong decision taken by the Italian government. But again, I think that what happened back then, it was a success of Chinese diplomats that were trying to please the leader. They got their success, and then, for them was enough. And then again, the incentive that generated that success, which was basically made by the people that are the Chinese ambassador, the diplomatic corps that works on Italy and gets promoted because, generate this, bring this gift to the leader, now that the agreement was about to expire again, the same machine starts once again. But this is a deficiency of the Chinese political system, and at the same time, it's a weakness of the system. So if the real answer was not what China could have done economically or what building a bridge, Italians, there is plenty of capital to build the bridge. We don't really need China to build infrastructure in Italy. The problem in Italy is not lack of capital, it's lack of investment. These are two different things. But China have done what they could do according to the structure of the two economies. But I think that politically, probably they could have been wiser. But at the same time, this shows how minimal is the importance of Italy in the eyes of Beijing, at least of the leadership of Beijing.
Yet, will Beijing see this as a failure? From what you say, in Italy, it's not going to make any kind of waves politically because it's not an issue central to Meloni's government or the wider Italian public opinion. There may be economic interests that might be compromised here. But from China's perspective, though, having, a pillar of European economy like Italy, a key Mediterranean country, pull out of BRI, how are they going to package it for their own domestic audience or the party's consumption, Enrico? And
yeah.
Linked to that, obviously folks in Athens will look at Italy's position, and will they see it then as greater opportunity for Greece to capitalize on this failure for China to get even more investments from China, or not?
Okay, so the way how they are already packaging this, if you look at what has been written in China on this topic, what is along the lines of the Ukrainian war, the Israeli war, the idea is that, okay, blame the Americans, okay? So now it's even this decision is like blame the US, is the US putting pressure. So basically Italy is going to be framed as in Chinese call it zogo, which means running dog of the United States, the same way how Italy was depicted by China back during the Cold War, basically as a country that is mostly among all the European countries probably is the one that tends to be more prone to American pressure. The reality is actually more infantile because in the end the agreement was signed for two parties that were the two parties that at the government at the time used for Italian foreign policy, namely the memorandum of understanding with China, to compete domestically. So one party was using the pro-China card, to increase the constituency among those that were anti-European and anti-Americans, and the other party all of a sudden became much more Atlantic, and so start criticizing China. But the reality, there was no such a big figure, such a big choice. It was a very, controversial decision, but not brave, not visionary. There was not such a thing. I remember the time people were discussing about Italy leaving NATO. So it's impossible. So China is going to package in this way, and I don't think that this is going to generate necessarily or shouldn't. But this is an interesting question. Don't you actually? I ask you a question. Don't you think it would be very very disruptive for the image of China and the Belt Road Initiative if a country like Italy leaves the Belt Road Initiative, simply doesn't renew the Memorandum of Understanding, and China react with retaliation. I mean, this is like what happened. I'm Sicilian. This is what happened in Cosa Nostra, right? I mean, it's an organization that you can join and you cannot leave. You know, and Italians are very.
California, huh? You can check in anytime, but you can never leave.
It's a very sensitive point. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that, you know, if something may happen, I mean, of course, maybe at custom level, they may generate sort of less, you know, we are going to have less incentive probably, but did we get better incentive? I think that I don't see, and plus, this is the reason why the timing of this decision is important, because it was taken after the approval of the anti-coercion instrument at the European level, and it was leaked before the European Union and the so the Italian government is telling Beijing, listen, this is a decision that has a European dimension. Okay, we are tuning ourselves, you know, to all the other countries at the European Union level. France doesn't have a memorandum of understanding. Germany, but they have like splendid trade with the PRC, so it's not needed. You know what I mean? So this is like.
So that's more for cover though, against probably Chinese retaliation, a la Canada, Lithuania, Australia, and such like. But that is as a complete different. The coercive action against Lithuania and Canada, they have different origin. Yeah, I agree absolutely. But in terms of you were saying about if there's going to be how it affects China's image and strategy, if you like, it's public.
Yeah, this is certainly okay. So this is yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. But first of all, you know, look. This is the Italian government, the two governments, actually, the decision was taken 3 days ago. I mean, the message, the note from the Minister of Foreign Affairs was sent 3 days ago. The decision was taken jointly, in the sense that it was communicated by the Secretary General of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you know, when was it, September. After the visit of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, there was the Secretary General traveled to Beijing to somehow, you know, clarify that this is a decision taken. And it was the tone was very low. There were no official communication by both sides, which means that they don't want to make too much fuss about it. Okay, and so Italy doesn't want China to lose face. So this is going to vanish, in my opinion, in a few days. Then, of course, someone would try to ride and overemphasize this decision in order to make China lose face. But do you think that? I mean, honestly, the impact of this decision on what UAE, which kind of impact the decision is going to have on UAE? I think zero. Okay, so and China will say, okay, Italy is leaving. The media they're going to say is leaving because Italy is has the pressure of Brussels, of the United States, and so. You know, inside of this campaign of containment against China, you know, this is a political decision. It's not an economic one, and so I don't think that the impact is going to be that big. Of course, it's important because it's the first time someone is leaving the Belt Road Initiative. So the main message is that actually the Belt Road Initiative can be joined and you can also leave. But it's an open initiative, so it's supposed to be like that.
Enrico, I want you to elaborate a bit about and on this challenge of the latest tragedy that is happening and shaping in Middle East at the moment, and this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Trade requires stability. Trade requires, peace brokership, and with the erosion of U.S. clout, at least in the eyes of global South, in eyes of many. Isn't there an opportunity now again for China to come and say, look, our global security initiative is something that is at least worth trying. Everything else hasn't worked. And is there as well from the European Union and Brussels, and then, sense of it would be nice if China could step forward and do some things at the international level as entente between Saudi Arabia and Iran? is there a sense in Brussels that, we wish the Chinese could do something, but we can't say it, or not?
They did say it. They even say it for Ukraine. I mean, the role that China plays is very important, simply because nobody can talk to Tehran, nobody can talk to Moscow. China can, and China can do this as a influential actor, member of the Security Council, so a legitimate actor, for stability. So I think that at a European level, the role of China it's quite recognized. The problem is that I think that the clout that China had on the Ukraine front has been lost in the Middle East, because there is a big difference in the position, which is slightly more radical, the position that China took in the case of the Gaza crisis. While in Ukraine, China, of course, the position was, as we call it, pro-Russian neutrality, but China had nonetheless the capacity to talk to the Ukrainians and Kuleba, and was a credible actor even for Kuleba as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. All along the crisis, China managed to have the capacity access on both sides. When it comes to Israel, China had lost credibility in Israel very much. So the position taken in Gaza, it's much more, I would say, leftist, if I may use a categories. It's more pro-Palestinian than neutrality. So it's a pro-Palestinian neutrality as much as the pro-Russian neutrality, but it's more pro-Palestinian than neutral. This the position, and this deprived China from the unique role of being capable to talk successfully to both sides. And China needs, for example, the US to, in this case, as much as the US, they need China. The Europeans, of course, are quite left apart, which is so. I think that one of the things that is stemming from this crisis, that the European Union is once again losing ground in terms of capacity to be a credible actor, in the securitization and the pacification of the region. So somehow reminds me of the 1956 crisis, the Suez crisis, in Egypt, where the two superpowers basically, proved the world and the whole European powers, that they were in control, and in command. And it's interesting to see that actually the ceasefire in Gaza was stemming from the 48 hours after the meeting in San Francisco, which is this is very important, because actually can create an optimist frame, window of opportunity, for these two countries to play détente instead of procrastinate this kind of very dangerous, escalation in the and competition. So China has a role, because China, in my opinion, the main stakes that China has in this crisis in the Middle East, it's a relationship with Tehran, which is, as you know, a very important actor, in the I would say radicalization or of the region. I'm not an expert of the Middle East, so I don't want to do too much analysis. I mean, I may choose the wrong words, and the words are very important when it comes to this kind of this situation. But again, I don't think that the global security initiative is as a real, future, is instrumental. Everything that China does in the region is meant to favor. So the main interest China has in the region is not to solve or to be, absorbed or in the local conflict. It's not even a solution of local conflict. China just again is the implementation at the regional level of anti-hegemonic policies. So the idea is that the more countries are moving away from or that are proving or are showing sign of independence and autonomy vis-a-vis Washington, UAE, for example, Saudi Arabia, for example, this is already a success for China. It's a further step, in the capacity that China has to partner up with actors that are less inclined to accept American, influence and diktat, or America, the United States as a security guarantor. So this is the global security initiative. It's like actually depriving the United States from their capacity to export and impose security first and foremost. Then we will take some form probably once this horizon has been achieved, but we are still quite far from there, and especially the presence of U.S. Navy close to Israel, I think, is a clear sign of the intention of the U.S. to, somehow maintain a role and deny China. Deprive China from this successful operation.
So, the point that China would like to dehegemonize the international system. So during this crisis, China had the presidency of the Security Council, Enrico. And while, the representatives made some diplomatic gestures, for a whole month, they could have shifted the dial in a direction that would have been more favorable towards them, particularly following the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting in San Francisco. So did they not have the capacity to mobilize a giant like the Security Council, or did they want to risk losing their own mojo by putting themselves on the line and then be seen to be failing? Are they too conservative?
Can you repeat the first part of the question, because I lost it?
So why didn't they use their presidency of the Security Council for a whole month during this crisis, the Middle East crisis, to try and advance their own dehegemonization agenda? Because they had the whole world at their disposal at that time. And yet they one step forward, two step back. Is it because they are genuinely conservative in the small c, that they don't want to take risks that would jeopardize their image globally? Or didn't they have the capacity to do what they wish to do in their own minds?
This is a great question. I think the strategy requires, a sense of timing, and I think that in general, if you look at the position of the Beijing position in the area, is actually quite clearly following the anti-hegemonic logic, in the sense that for China, the idea to create a united front, an Islamic united front, not an Arab united front, an Islamic united front, riding the anti-Israeli and therefore anti-American sentiment in the region, is already working quite well and can be considered successful. But at the same time, China doesn't want to overplay, or over-radicalize, its stance in the region, especially given the fact that I think that we tend to forget that there is a growing and awareness and huge a rising limitation within China due to the deep crisis, deep problem, structural problem the Chinese economy has. And so China is aware that, in order to deal with these issues, somehow needs a sort of more peaceful or cooperative relation as emerged in San Francisco with the West, and first and foremost with the United States. The Pan Gongsheng, which is like the head of the People's Bank of China, clearly referred to the seriousness of this of the correction that the Chinese economy is supposed to take now, and the implication of this are actually serious, severe. So how about what if actually there is we consider Chinese diplomacy somehow as detached, because we give for granted the fact that I keep talking about this, Anush, in our meeting I always say this. I think that even the perception that PRC has in the region is somehow disconnected with the reality of a China that is not rising anymore, but is declining. So how a declining China can sustain its commitment and these initiatives, including the one that Ali mentioned before, the Global Security Initiative, in the same way how a rising China or a perceived rising China could do. So it's a different. So I think that a declining China needs to come to terms that this radical anti-hegemonic action has to be diluted over the time, because now is not time for counterposition, but it's more time for dialogue and pacification.
Very interesting, Enrico. We are coming to a point that I have to ask our official question from our guests, but I want to pack one more in there just quickly, very shortly and briefly. Yes, yes. I see Anush wagging his finger at me. Today, China does more trade with the global South than Europe, US, and Japan combined. This is a fact. So the trade of China with the global South is growing. Is there something to be done by EU to better reset itself in the global South as a market, as an opportunity, as an economy? Because EU has been pumping 80 to 100 billion a year, equal to BRI's investment, in various investments in global South. That is one question. The last question with which we always close, and I love to have your thoughts, is that sitting in Europe, sitting at the heart of a country that is leaving BRI dialogues. Wow, BRI Belt Road Initiative. I'm so much flattered by our own program, but I hope you don't leave BRI dialogues anytime soon. Living BRI, what would be your most significant piece of advice in these precarious times to the Sinophobes and Sinophiles? If you were to leave them with one piece of advice on both sides, what would that be? So the first question, the biggest trade with the global South, and is there a reset to be done by EU? And then the single advice to Sinophobes and Sinophiles.
Okay, so first of all, forgive me if I basically I challenge your question, but I don't believe that the global South is a useful category. I mean, it's functional to refer to like a certain group of countries, but their geopolitical nature and it's even for the European Union is very different. I would say that for the EU is actually now very much focused on Africa. I mean, there is, of course, especially Italy. We have a specific plan, the Pian Mattei plan, that is focused on Africa, and the idea is connected to the risk and to the challenges of immigration that Italy first and foremost has to deal with, but and is going to grow in the future. And so I would say that this is the way how China comes in. The way how I see it is it's more as okay. It's more a security dimension. So in this case, the role of China is important because as long as we, cooperate or we manage to create, better opportunities in the southern shore of the Mediterranean, in sub-Saharan Africa, the better for stabilization and security. So this is, I would say, like a sort of joint interest. At the same time, there is also suspicious in the way how China operates in this how China uses its presence in order to maximize influence, at times not very successfully, I must say. So we tend to sometimes to overlap presence with influence, but actually they're not connected, especially when it comes to China. So I think that what the Europe has should do. I am actually a fan of the initiative. I think that first probably I didn't answer that part of the question. I apologize. I'm a fan of the rationale that is inspiring, for example, the dialogue between Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and India. Or better, Israel, UAE, and India. And actually, Italy joined this initiative very happily. And I think there is like some interesting rationale there. But the reality is that I think that simply put, the way how the Belt Road Initiative has been unfolded in the last 10 years is simply not sustainable for China. So I think that the quality and the quantity of the competition is going to vanish, and so what is going to remain, in my opinion, is mostly a competition based on technology and standards, which is probably the most successful part of this Belt and Road Initiative, so the digital component of it. And this is something that for the European Union really matters a lot, because we, for example, having Saudi Arabia, UAE applying, importing Chinese standards for IT and all the normative implication of it, for the European Union, this could have like a very long-term implication. So, this kind of, I would say, the governance, the implication for governance that the imports of Chinese technology will have in the part of Global South that is important for the European Union, I think this is certainly like a central challenge for Europe.
And your piece of advice to xenophobes and xenophiles?
Okay. To xenophobe and xenophile, first of all, my piece of advice would be just talk to each other. Just try to talk to each other, guys. I mean, China is Chinese people are amazing people, and I think that maybe because I'm a hyper optimist, as Anush said, but this helps me to a lot actually. I think that we will come to terms, and we will find like eventually there will be a face of China will emerge in the next years that is much more comparable and much more realistic than this kind of comic and scary version that are being produced by both sides.
Right. Yeah. Enrico, you are the second world expert to echo that very last point to me over the last 2 weeks. Another China expert who had worked in and on China since 1979 said this very thing in our little series of lectures on China here that both you and Ali are going to appear. And she said that literally verbatim that in the next few years you're going to see China normalizing and this gray wolf strategy taking a back step. And I take real heart in that message coming across from experts such as yourselves, but you putting it in the context of a much more of a optimistic, looking forward to hopefully a process of dialogue and constructive change coming at that level, rather than this polarization. I mean, Ali's point about Trump is concerning, obviously, because we really don't know how he will shake up the world. But you've given us so many interesting depth of insight about European thinking, about Chinese thinking. I mean, our audience ought to note that you worked at the University of Peking, China's foremost university, with apologies to Tsinghua and other universities. You have direct experience of China and its system and people and so on. So for you to say that is really significant, that our audiences do hear it, and also for you to being so open and insightful in the comments that you've made is really, really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Anush. Just my last point, which is actually it's related to what we are talking about. I think that how about we say this? Considering the trajectory that other actors like South Korea, Taiwan, for example, took in Asia, from a more authoritarian to a more liberal-oriented, system, which is, actually this transition actually helped them a lot, in growing their economies, getting over the middle-income trap, and becoming like, look at South Korea, very powerful, soft power. South Korea is like, it's incredible. In my university now, we have more people studying Koreans than studying Chinese, super powerful. So how about this? He's maybe, I'm not saying, I don't want to sound like anti, I'm not calling for a regime change or in China, not at all. I mean, I don't want to sound like so hawkish, but I think that is a sort of rationalization of processes. If China moving back to a more Dengist approach, somehow coming back to terms with a positive synergy with the West, I think, you know, this may actually generate a transition, a change, also political to a certain extent, that actually may turn China in 2 decades into a much more competitive actor than the China that we are facing today. So paradoxically, I think that, you know, maybe, you know, in 20 years from now, we may, you know, we may have a more democratic China or liberal China that becomes much more, you know, competitive, you know, than the China we are experiencing now. We'll see.
I hope you're all around the same table again to look at it in 20 years' time as well, Enrico. So thank you very much with those final thoughts for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico.
Thank you, Anush. Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for having me.
Grazie mille.